Hello, today I will be talking about Nancy Drew. My sources come from Nancy Drew and the Sister Sleuths, essay on the fiction of girl detectives, written by Kent Baxter. Solving the Crime of Modernity, Nancy Drew in 1930, written by Amy Boesky. The Taking the Hidden Staircase to the Murder Castle, the Nancy Drew Mystery Series, and the First Serial Killer in the United States, by Michelle Abate. Sexuality Interruption and Nancy Drew, Girlhood Studies, Volume 8, Number 2, written by Michael G. Cornelius. Nancy Drew, Sexual Deviancy and Rewrites in the 20th Century America, by Brittany Brown. And The Nancy Drew's Body, The Case of the Autonomous Female Sleuth, written by Jennifer Woolston. I have been a fan of Nancy Drew my whole life. She is a mystery-solving teenage girl. Her father is a lawyer, and she's well known by local police in her community. She's well-respected. She's very smart. She's got really good friends. She has a boyfriend named Ned, depending on, which stories you're reading. The novels were first written in 1930. They are all mystery novels, and she solves a different case in every book. Here I have the first 10 novels and a reprint of one of the original ones, The Secret of the Old Clock. Just to get started, I guess, how many female characters in storytelling have we seen represented in print, comics, books, video games, movies, television, and whose mystery could be connected to the first serial killer in the U.S., H.H. Holmes? No one other than Nancy Drew. She's a female character, and she's been inspiring young women since 1930. She's continued to exist because of the ability to, vary the way that she's represented in American culture. And she's an unstoppable character, very important to history. And now that the beginning of the 20th century, she helped to define, the beginning of the 20th century would be the early 1900s. She helped to define what it meant to be a teenager when the separation between children and adults became much more apparent. Nancy Drew started as a series of mystery novels in the 1930s, and a female detective counterpart to the Hardy Boys, which are also a series of novels written by the same original gentleman who wrote the books. Both series were meant for teens at the time and helped define a new concept of separating the age between childhood and adulthood. In the 1930s, it wasn't really important to be a teenager. They weren't really referred to as anything different than being adults, and these novels were first published in the 1930s and seen as the greatest phenomenon among the 50 centers, 50 centers being 50 cent books, and that was written by Forbes in 1934. This was also during the age of the Depression, so they felt that they were a good value. Forbes saw the novels as a good value when people didn't really have a lot of expendable income, and it offered a new view of the middle class, which was just beginning to form at the time. There was the very poor and the very rich, and they were starting to see a little bit more of a middle class. Having survived the Depression, Nancy Drew experienced many revisions of who she was at her core. She changed much over the years, just as American society changed. And many revisions have been made but who she is at the core pretty much stayed the same. Michael G. Cornelius, one of the authors, suggests that the journal titled that he wrote, Sexuality Interruption in Nancy Drew, that Nancy Drew steered away from her previous avoidance of conversations about marriage and being a partner and the importance of what that was to her. She was more interested in solving mysteries. She would rather marry a mystery than marry a man. As the 1950s kind of started to roll around, the writer of Nancy Drew at the time gave her more of a dependent role, someone who's more interested in family life, someone who's a little bit more dependent on law enforcement and is not so critical of law enforcement. Someone that is willing to talk about being married one day as opposed to not at all and just avoiding the question altogether. But the Cornelia states that the essentials of Nancy Drew's character, her strong desire for social justice, her ability to accomplish whatever task she set her mind to, and her need to unravel mysteries all remain intact. He states that maybe it wasn't Nancy changing at all, but the world around her changing and her adaptation to those changes, just as, women were adapting to changes at that time as well. Although another text that I use as a source states that they believe that this transition to a softer and more feminine version of the sleuth was not so positive, and that Nancy Drew was a victim of the general sanitization of children's literature in the 1950s and 60s, and altered to fit the venerated heteronormative sexual roles of the period. Whether or not this was a positive change for Nancy, it did help her to stay relevant through the 1950s and into the next era of teenagers. So it really helped her to, adapt to the times and continue to stay relevant. With each revision of Nancy Drew, or each addition to the universe, games, books, comics, movies, television, there came a new Carolyn Keene. This name is a pseudonym that all authors have used and have written under since the first publication. Many have written stories about Nancy Drew, giving them their own personal flair and allowing Nancy a place in each generation of female sleuths. I think that gives each author the ability to be just as relatable to the current generation as the previous author was to the generation they identified with. Not only has the sleuth changed with each publication, but has evolved into other media like comic books. I'm currently reading Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys, The Big Lie, which was published in 2017. Breathes new life into these characters, and it's just a lot edgier than the original novels were. There's like murder, things that weren't necessarily considered appropriate in novels back in 1930s. It's also a highly successful video game series that actually helped me to stay connected to Nancy Drew all these years. The first entry in the PC game was from 1998, and I have a ton of them. Really a big fan of all, facets of Nancy Drew. Throughout history, Nancy Drew has found a way to stay relevant, stay connected to modern culture, and survive the test of time. Because of the diversification of media, Nancy Drew continues to exist in American culture and continues to be a source of mystery and wonder for young female readers. And I think that she'll continue to stay relevant as long as people keep trying to diversify the way that they tell her story.